Thanks everyone for coming. I have the slightly unenviable task of trying to explain the incredibly complex, diverse and varied agricultural system that the world has, and what that means both in terms of our climate, how it's affecting our climate, and how it will be affected. So forgive me if some of this is done in broad brushstrokes. I have written a long piece for the forthcoming International Socialism Journal on this topic, and you can read that hopefully to get more about it. Firstly, why are we having a meeting on agriculture, food and climate change? The first reason is obvious. It's to do with the growing and worsening environmental crisis, particularly climate change, but also biodiversity, which is directly affected in many ways by the agricultural system. I don't have time to talk about that now, so I'm just going to leave that there as the backdrop for most of what I say that follows. The second reason we're having this talk is, again, something I haven't got time to dwell on, but it is again worth bearing in mind, which is that the agricultural system I'm going to describe and explain to you is a system that systematically fails to feed millions of people around the world. According to the United Nations, depending on which of their reports you read, between 800 million and 1 billion people go hungry or are malnutritious every single day. And even in the richest economies, that is an everyday occurrence for many, many people. In the United States, for instance, 48 million Americans live in food insecurity, meaning that they regularly miss, every day or so, a meal because they can't afford it. That's 14% of the households in the world's richest economy. And in Britain, we know very well that 1 million people or more rely on food banks. And that's in the context of the food system I'm going to describe, which wastes approximately a third of its food that is produced every year. And the third reason we're having this meeting is that the question of food, diet and agriculture is increasingly being posed as a significant question and solution in terms of the climate crisis. This has always been there. There's always been arguments about how people's diets affect the climate and the environment, but in recent years this has taken on a much bigger and important role, in part because of a film that's recently been made called Cowspiracy. I'll pause to ask how many people have seen Cowspiracy. So that's very interesting. 2, 3, maybe a couple more people. You see, whenever I speak at meetings in the wider environmental movement, hundreds of people have seen Cowspiracy. Cowspiracy is a film made by a very famous American actor whose name I've completely forgotten because I'm useless like that. It's on Netflix. I've watched something like 20,000, 30,000 times in the last couple of weeks. It's a film that argues that the agricultural industry, and in particular the meat industry, is the systematic cause of all environmental crisis. I'll quote Leonardo DiCaprio, that's the man I'm thinking of. Animal agriculture is the leading cause of deforestation, water consumption and pollution. It's responsible for more greenhouse gases than the transportation industry and is a primary driver of rainforest destruction, species extinction, habitat loss, topsoil erosion, ocean dead zones and virtually other environmental ill. And the film argues that 51% of world emissions come from animal agriculture, more than any other sector. Now, I'm going to argue in this meeting, and I'm going to explain why I believe Cowspiracy is wrong in terms of pointing to the meat industry as the primary cause of environmental disaster. I'll explain why and why are my figures. However, I do understand that large sections, particularly in the environmental movement, take these arguments very, very seriously. Just to give a couple of examples from recent environmental demonstrations in London and Paris, where there were large blocks, people may have been there, of vegan and vegetarian organisations who had placards that says things like, "Want to change the climate, change your diet, go vegan," or "There's no such thing as a meat-eating environmentalist." The Guardian a couple of months ago had a headline, "Eat less meat to avoid dangerous global warming." So in this meeting I am going to focus on the question of the whole agricultural system, but I also am going to take on some of those arguments because they are very real arguments, even for those of you who haven't seen Cowspiracy, very real arguments in the movement outside there. And I'm going to argue that if we want to have a food system and an agricultural industry that is both sustainable in the long term and can feed the world's population in a sustainable way, we will have to have systemic changes not simply rely on individual changes to diet and so on. So let's start with some of the pictures. I've been trying to find a picture to sum up how the agricultural industry is seen by most people, and here it is. This is the way that many of us are taught to view agriculture from a very young age. This is a picture from a children's book, Life on the Farm. You'll see all the animals living happily there, the lush green fields, and the farmer holding a little baby sheep, a lamb, presumably for the slaughter. The reality, the next few slides are going to show the reality of the animal industry in particular, and the non-animal agricultural industry. I apologise because they're not pleasant really. Here's the reality of a beef farm. This is a beef farm in the United States. Factory beef farming like this is it's the dominant way that most beef that you will have had if you've eaten beef in the last week or so comes to us. This is actually quite a small scale farm. The Chinese government has just funded a beef farm for export to Russia that houses 100,000 cattle inside. They never see the outside. So just to give you a sense of the scale, these next few pictures are pictures from the air of similar fields. This gives you a sense of the industrialised scale of farming and what it means in terms of animals and food. That is, the bit on the left there is that previous slide's farm, and this on the right here is a lagoon of manure runoff stored from all the cattle stored, and we'll talk a little bit later about the consequences for that for the planet and for the people who live around these sort of farms. It's not just the meat industry though. This large-scale industrialised farming that is incredibly dependent on fossil fuels, chemicals, pesticides and so on is also true of the non-meat food industry as well. Here is an agricultural landscape from the air, the ground packaged up into parcels of land and crops. And again, to give you a sense of the scale of what this means, you know, enormous farms, enormous fields requiring dozens of combine harvesters to harvest and so on. So that's an image to you to bear in mind when we talk about it. It isn't the small happy little farmers feeding the world by and large. It is this sort of farming that feeds the world in the dominant way. Right. Let's talk about the environmental impact of agriculture. First, in terms of climate change, agriculture is a key contributor to climate change for three main reasons. The first of which is that agriculture is responsible for almost all the deforestation that takes place in the world. Since the year 2000, around 70% of tropical deforestation has happened because of agriculture. Industrial agriculture, as I mentioned, is heavily dependent on fossil fuels and other chemicals. John Bellamy Foster famously writes that it's the art of turning oil into food. And increasingly, agriculture is responsible for growing crops that are either used as fuel for biofuels or for animal feed, and we'll come on to that question in a bit. In 2011, global emissions from agriculture are around 5,300 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which was an increase of about 9% on the previous decade, and that's predicted to increase by a further 30% by the year 2050. And a 2012 study argues that food systems as a whole contribute between 19 and 29% of greenhouse gas emissions, of which 80 to 85% is from agriculture. Just to take up the question really about the role of the meat industry, the animal agriculture. Animals are responsible for a lot of emissions, particularly the greenhouse gas methane. But increasingly under industrialised agriculture, and the sort of agriculture that we described in those pictures there, the production of meat, of milk, of eggs and wool comes from the consumption of animal feed that has been grown from agriculture. And this is an incredibly inefficient process in terms of the energy exchange. So vast amounts of land have to be used to produce the animal feed for small numbers of cows and goats and sheep and so on. So that means that when you eat beef, the energy you can get from that beef is something like 35 times less than the energy that's been put in to produce it. Now, traditionally, animals were fed on crops that couldn't be eaten, grass that couldn't be eaten by humans, grass and so on. But as I'm going to argue, that under capitalism, increasingly what happens is that animals are fed on food that could be eaten by humans. And one of the madnesses, if you like, of the food system is that we effectively do waste potential food through it being concentrated into animals and so on. And the makers of Cowspiracy and some other campaigners focus on this aspect to argue that the way forward is for everyone to become a vegetarian or a vegan. They argue, as I said, that 50% of world emissions come from animal agriculture. Now, the problem is those figures are wrong. Those figures, I would argue, are based on several mistaken studies and have been, how can I say, heavily criticised by the scientific community and those independent studies into agriculture. For instance, Cowspiracy wrongly includes the respiration of animals and the carbon dioxide they emit through breathing in their figures. They attribute higher impacts to the role of methane in terms of its global warming and so on. They have differences around the total number of animals they count for the world and so on. Those are problems and mistakes. The problem is that when the scientists have written critiques of the film, the filmmakers have closed ranks and refused to acknowledge those differences. The contemporary figure from the United Nations and the IPCC and the Union of Concerned Scientists and so on is that animal agriculture is responsible for around 15% or slightly more of emissions of carbon dioxide gases. That's still incredibly high, and I don't want anyone to go away and say, haha, Martin is saying there's nothing wrong with the meat industry in terms of climate change. I'm saying that we do need a fundamental transformation of how agriculture is, in particular the animal industry, but I don't think the sort of apocalyptic way that Cowspiracy portrays the question is the argument. And one of the reasons for that is a conclusion that was made by a scientist who's not particularly radical, writing for the Union of Concerned Scientists, who says that movies like Cowspiracy aren't believable, not only because of how they twist the science, because of what they ask us to believe. They ask us to believe that the fossil fuel industry isn't the main cause of global warming, that the transition to clean energy isn't what matters, and that thousands of scientists have covered up the truth about the most important environmental issue of our time. For instance, one of the notable things about watching the film is it doesn't mention the names of any agricultural corporations. It doesn't mention the role of the supermarkets. It doesn't talk about the question of food and profits. It has a complete blindness to agriculture outside of the United States. And so, for instance, it doesn't talk about the important role of animals in terms of ploughing, distributing and using food around the world. I haven't really got time to go into great detail about the other environmental impacts of agriculture, but they are many. There's the enormous amount of water that has to go into producing crops and animals, water that's often then consequently polluted, causing dead zones. The dead zone in the Mississippi Delta in the United States and the Gulf of Mexico is now the biggest extent ever, and that's caused by chemical runoffs in the rivers feeding the Mississippi, which then spills into the agriculture. Something like 7,000 square miles of dead sea where animals and plants can no longer live. There are all sorts of other problems, as I mentioned, about the overuse of pesticides, the overuse of antibiotics, and the impact on those who work in the industry, and so on. And sadly, I don't really have time to talk about some of those. I do want to say, if you do want to explore this further, there's a number of books which I would recommend. A very good book by a man called Philip Limbury called Tharmageddon, which condenses many of these discussions and arguments, and I would recommend reading that.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Tharmageddon by Philip Limbury. The modern food system is dominated by a very small number of incredibly large and very powerful corporations. To illustrate this, I'm going to talk about just one of them, a company called Cargill. Very few people have heard of Cargill. They founded back in 1865, and they are now the world's largest private corporation. They employ 150,000 people in 70 different countries, and they trade everything from cotton to animal feed, cocoa, salt. Almost everything you have probably eaten at some point in the last month has had some link to Cargill. Their 2015 sales were $120 billion with profits of $1.6 billion. They're an enormous organisation. Cargill themselves say about their beef wing, and listen very carefully to the language they use, this is from their website. Cargill Beef is one of North America's largest beef processors, harvesting more than 8 million cattle and producing nearly 8 billion pounds of boxed beef and byproducts each year. Cargill owns 500 ships, including 120 Cape-sized vessels, the largest dry goods systems in the world. And that really represents the domination, the centralisation, the monopoly of enormous corporations in terms of food. It's not just them. There are 4 companies that are responsible for 80% of beef production, and 3 of those companies, together with another 4th company, represent 60% of pork production. And 50% of chicken production comes from just 4 other companies. So the meat industry on its own is dominated very much by these very powerful, very large organisations. And related to that is the role of the supermarkets. And I know in previous Marxisms we've had a number of meetings about these questions, but the way the supermarkets, with their buying power linked to particularly these large corporations, can fundamentally shape the agricultural system and impact upon the lives of peasants and farmers. This sense of pile it high and sell it cheap in terms of food means that they have an enormous squeeze, if you like, on those producing food. They dictate the type of crops grown, the species of animals grown. They dictate sizes of crops, what crops look like. They force farmers to discard fruit and vegetable that doesn't match the image that they want to portray. They help to fix prices or set prices, often below production cost, which can help impoverish farmers or drive them into debt, and so on. You may have seen a debate around that around milk in the last few years in the UK, and partly because they desperately want to have the perfect apple or the perfect carrot for sale in the supermarkets. They encourage the heavy use of chemicals, the heavy use of pesticides, and they also encourage waste, because they force farmers to discard crops that don't hit the mark, or if they haven't remain unsold at the end of the day, they're also thrown away. The supermarket business model is based on a business model where waste is absolutely endemic to the supply and sale of food. Now, the global food system, of which supermarkets and corporations are a big part, has been very much shaped like that, particularly in the post-war period, by those big bastions of neoliberalism, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. In the 1980s and 1990s, the structural adjustment programs that were imposed upon Africa in particular were all about transforming those agricultural systems, those economies, but also the agricultural systems, into feed-in systems for the wider food system of the developed world. And this was very much consciously done by the United States government in particular. Back in 1986, John Block, then the US Agricultural Secretary, said that the idea that developing countries should feed themselves is an idea of history. They'd be better to ensure their food security by relying on US agricultural products which are available at lower cost. And alongside that, what they did was to turn the food producers of Africa, of South America, of Asia and so on, into producers of commodities that could be exported to the West: the coffee, the tea, the cocoa, and the rest of it. And what they have done, together with the power of the IMF, is to smash the old state-sponsored, in many cases, agricultural systems, and lock those developing economies into a food system where they produce for this consumption in the West, and they buy food back from the highly industrialised farming that we saw in those pictures early from Europe and America and Canada and so on. The irony, of course, is that the vast majority of agricultural production in the world does still happen like this. It happens through peasant labour, often with the use, but not always, with the use of animals. And vast amounts of food is still produced in this way, particularly for export. So when they talk about technology helping both the environment and to produce more food, they mean it for a very specific type of agriculture that is dominant in North America and Europe, not for most of the world. Now, I want to try and explore now how we got here, because I think that's a fundamental question when we're trying to understand the impact of the agricultural system that we have, how it impacts upon us as humans and the natural world. Back in 1862, the German chemist Justus von Liebig, who was a man who was a scientist who was enormously influential upon Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in terms of soil science and so on, he described the intensive farming that dominated in England as a system of robbery of the soil that took away the essential nutrients that were in the soil systematically, so that they weren't replaced, and left in their wake a sort of, a desert, if you like. And Marx built on this. There's whole sections of Capital where he talks about the British and the English food system and how the soil fertility is being systematically eroded and destroyed as the nutrients are taken away to the people who work in the cities, and then their waste, the sewage, is dumped in the sea. And Marx describes this as humans disturbing the metabolic interaction between man and earth. And for Marx, the development of capitalism was all about the fundamental transformation of how land was used in rural areas and how food and agriculture was produced. And in a sort of very simplistic way, what Marx talks about is with the rise of capitalism, you get a transformation of agriculture from producing for use, converting it to production for exchange. It was no longer about food being produced to feed people, but food being produced as a commodity to sell for profit. And that process of transformation from the old feudal ways of doing it and the old peasantry in England, and indeed then later on across the whole globe, was a vicious and nasty process. Marx describes the brutal consequences of the enclosures of common land, the engrossing of estates, the depopulation of the countrysides, the forcing of peasants into urban areas to become the workers for the factories and so on. And those that remained in the countryside, by and large, were converted into wage labourers, working on other people's land, not on their own, to provide food for themselves and their communities and their families. And production under capitalism, true of agriculture as any other industry, production under capitalism is based on the accumulation of wealth for the sake of accumulation to make profits. And because of this, production is short term. It's based on what maximises profits, not what the impact upon the natural world is, and so on. And Marx analyses this through that, as I said, that process of degradation of the soil fertility in the countryside, and he uses what occurs with agriculture as a sort of metaphor for the wider impact of the rise of capitalism upon humans and their relationship with the natural world. This metabolic rift that he talks about between human society and the natural world. And this rift, he argues, has its origins in the social relations associated with capitalist development, a system of production that treats the natural world only as part of the productive process. Now, I'm not trying to argue that before capitalism, agriculture didn't have an impact upon the natural world. That's of course not true. But what Marx is arguing, what I'm trying to argue, is with the rise of capitalism, that the need to produce food to make a profit, to sell, you get a systematic, irreparable rift in the interdependent processes of social metabolism. Now that sounds very fancy, so I'm going to illustrate it by talking about almonds. I bought a packet of almonds. I like almonds. There's not enough to go around, but we will. The person who gets the best contribution can have one. Almonds, you see, are incredible. There's a packet of M&S almonds. Now, almonds come from places like this. Actually, places is the wrong word. Place. 80% of the world's almonds come from California. Hey, you've read the same books I have, haven't they? 60 million almond trees. 60 million almond trees in 250,000 hectares. Most of them in areas that are actually classed on geography atlases as semi-desert. Looks a bit like it, doesn't it? I mentioned earlier Philip Limbury's book Farmageddon. Philip goes there and describes some of the farms. He describes this area as a deeply disturbing place where not a blade of grass nor tree or hedgerow grows. The phenomenal output of fruit and veg is possible only to a cocktail of chemicals and the plundering of the crystal clear rivers that run down from the Sierra Nevada mountains. farmers have been able to pull off a multi-billion-dollar conjuring trick, extracting harvest from soil which is so depleted of natural matter it might as well be brown polystyrene. The very nature of these farms, he argues, the monocropping, the use of single crops to the extent of anything else, the heavy reliance on pesticides and fertilisers creates a sterile environment where insects and bees and so on are utterly absent. But of course, someone here said it. How do they pollinate it? You see, bees are absolutely essential to almonds. You need them to pollinate the almond trees. So what happens is the industrialised agriculture of the almond industry creates a secondary industrialised bee agriculture, where every single year 3,000 lorries drive across the United States carrying 40 billion bees to pollinate the almond trees, at the cost of $250 million every single year. I haven't got any pictures, unfortunately. But this is absolutely true. They move systematically thousands and thousands of beehives around the country to pollinate the crops, because the creation of their industrialised almond or whatever vegetables and fruits we're talking about here has so destroyed the environment that it wouldn't be possible to do it naturally. There's no better example, in my opinion, of the metabolic rift in the modern world. It brings to mind, I'm sure it brings to mind for all of you, a quote from the Grundrisse, Karl Marx. Agriculture, he writes, agriculture no longer finds the natural conditions of its own production within itself, naturally arisen and spontaneous and ready to hand, but these exist as an independent industry separate from it. And with this separateness, the whole complex set of interconnections in which agriculture exists is drawn into the sphere of conditions of agricultural production. I actually think he contradicts himself there, but he's talking about the way, all the different interactions in agriculture are distorting and dismissing each other as part of it. So, in this context, is meat eating the problem? Now, reducing meat emissions and other environmental damage from agriculture will not be tackled, I would argue, by individuals changing their diet. It's the particular way that production of food is organised under capitalism that is the single greatest destroyer of the planet and contributor to the environment. And I think that arguing to switch for a meat-free diet can be a dangerous strategy, because actually it puts the blame or the onus back on individuals, not as us as a collective, and not as the system that can create food crops grown in the natural equivalent of blown polystyrene. But there's another factor to it too, which is the Western diet that people eat, and is much derided for its impact upon the environment, is in itself an artificial construction of the capitalist system itself. In the 1950s, it was so profitable to grow grain that they needed to find a way to get rid of the grain, so they increased the amount of beef production in the United States, and then what they needed to do was to sell the beef. So they had mass campaigns in the 1950s and 1960s to get you to eat beef. Now, what that is that's an artificial construction and shaping of diet. Two delicious ways to keep yourself trim. Yeah. But an absolute crazy thing. And of course, then what that does is it creates the idea that the all-American diet, or the affluent diet, is that heavy meat centred diet, and that doesn't necessarily need to be so, and it can be transformed if we break the power of those corporations. The organisation that runs this is the American Meat Company. They're still out there at the American Meat Institute. They're still out there promoting meat and beef for its healthy overtones. The other factor to this, though, is that the decisions people make about food are very, very personal, but they are made within a wider system, a wider food system. So, processed food may be very, very bad for you. It may be very bad for the environment, but actually it's a real boon if you've worked 8 hours in a call centre and you've got to come home and make a meal for the kids. So the problem is that we can't separate the food choices from the wider questions of society, and that's why I think it's wrong to simply start from us changing people's diet. But that's not to say that the struggle for a sustainable agriculture isn't in any way separate from the struggle for a better food system and better diets for people. I think we want to fight for if you like, a more healthy choice for everyone. But that means changing the priorities of the system. There's a United Nations Food and Agricultural Organisation report that talks about the way that crop yields are starting to slow in terms of how they're growing because of the population rises and so on. And in it talks about one of the biggest problems with the diet for people around the world is that they what's the figure? I forget the figure. They use the phrase that large areas of the world stubbornly refuse to get out of poverty. You know, sure, poverty is the problem. Poverty is the problem. Poverty is one of the reasons people don't have the right diet. But that's not a choice that those people are making. That's a problem of the system itself. And I would argue that switching to an agricultural system that is that's healthy means breaking those power of those corporations. So let's move on to some alternatives very quickly. There exists already a number of ways to drastically reduce the emissions from agriculture. Just by generalising from best practices, the Food and Agriculture Organisation point out that you could reduce emissions from the meat industry itself by around 20% just by using the best things that people do in terms of technology and crops and so on. But they themselves again recognise that the barriers to doing this is not a lack of willingness by the peasants or the farmers. It's a fact that it will hit profits, or that they don't have the capital to deal with it. One of the solutions proposed is very much, if you like, from the left, is a switch and a transfer to small farms. The idea being you have to break the power of the corporations who do all that mad stuff with chemicals, and put the onus back on peasants who can do things like grow crops, mixed crops here to improve yields. This is maize and wheat being grown on a single farm. The problem with this, and there is a lot of truth in this, small farms tend to be better for biodiversity, their yields are higher because they mix crops, they use much less fossil fuels when compared to industrialised farmings, etc., etc. But there's a danger with this that you romanticise the peasantry and you say all that is good is the small, and the hard work of those farmers is what is needed for the future. Because the truth of it is the small farms out there, by and large, depend on really nasty, long hours of hard work by small family groups, often children and the old working. Half the working population in agriculture use animal power. The rest, only manual tools. 400 million peasants in the world today, 1/3 of the total of peasants, feed a further billion people using only manual tools. No fertiliser, no tractors, no pesticides, no livestock feed. That's hard labour, and I do not think a socially just, sustainable agricultural system will be one where we switch to reliance by forcing people to work in the third world or the developing economies of the global south in such a hard way. Back in 1889, Karl Kautsky was a German Marxist who wrote extensively about this stuff, said, "It would take a very obdurate admirer of small-scale land ownership to see the advantages derived from forcing small cultivators down to the level of beasts of burden into a life occupied by nothing other than work, apart from time set aside for sleeping and eating." So what's my solution? What's our solution? What's the revolutionary solution? And I think we have to look to two things here. One, we have to look to the power of those who work in the food industry, those peasants and farmers, and those who drive the lorries to distribute the food, and those people who look after the bees that pollinate the crops and so on. They are the people who understand the food industry and know about how to produce food in a sustainable way. And we have to look to the power of them to start to change the world. We also have to look to the revolutionary traditions as well, which I think have started in very small ways in some parts of the world in the last 100 years to show how you can collectively run agriculture in a much better way. Now, I'm not trying to suggest, for instance, the forced agricultural collectivisation that took place in the Soviet Union was a positive model, but what we do see in revolutions, meeting previously, and here was about the Spanish Civil War, what we do see is about peasants coming together in the midst of revolution, taking their land under themselves to control and organise, and shaping their future in that way. And I think within that, as a revolution is successful and as the socialist economy starts to be able to offer much more, I think what you will see is the small farmer starting to gradually work in a much wider and much more collective way with those people around them. Back in the 1960s, Tony Cliff, who founded the SWP's tradition and its forefathers, wrote a little pamphlet which he described as a revisionist account of agriculture. He was arguing very much against the forced collectivisation of the Soviet Union. But he talked about how, well, I'll quote him, "Thus the organisation of agriculture into cooperative farms is bound to be an extremely slow process. The transition of agriculture from individual to collectivist methods will be the result of the abundance and wealth and culture in a highly developed society. Individual farming will not be overthrown, but it will be sublimated. So what I'm talking about now, if we want a sustainable agriculture, we have to break the power of those corporations, those supermarkets, those profit-hungry, massive organisations. We have to empower those people at the bottom of the food chain, if you like. That's a good pun there, isn't it? The people at the bottom of society to take control of that food system and start to shape it in ways that improve their lives and the food that we eat and when we eat it and how we eat it. And there are enormous struggles going on. Here's a struggle in Haiti against Monsanto in 2007, often very much forgotten by the left and around the world, because they're often people who are not on Twitter. They're often groups of people who self-organise and fight over particular land grabs. Here's an enormous demonstration of 50,000 farmers in India back in 2008, calling for government action on poverty, rural poverty. Now, I think we have to support those, but we also have to have a vision, I think, of how agriculture can be. And I think ultimately that means arguing really for the revolutionary transformation of the capitalist economy. It's not about, you can't separate what happens in agriculture, you can't separate the food on your plate from the bigger questions, the bigger the bigger picture. And I think ultimately it will be the smashing of that economy which can lead to a farming system that can feed the population in a sustainable way for the planet and for people. Thank you.
Right, folks, well, I stand before you accused of being a farmer, so I brought my dog to protect me in case there's any rioting. And actually, I have to confirm what Martin says. I mean, I had the longest holiday in 38 years, and I became a farmer 38 years ago. Last year, I had 3 weeks holiday, consecutive holiday. I do take days off. And, you know, I eat, sleep, and do a bit of politics. That's basically a farmer's life. But actually, and Martin's has covered a lot of the thing. But can I recommend a couple of things to you? Firstly, distrust environmental Puritans. They're the same as any other Puritans. They want to make you suffer because it makes them feel good. If you want to be a vegan because you enjoy it, be a vegan. But if you think by being a vegan you're going to save the world, don't bother. It isn't worth it. Meat tastes too nice. But the reality is, I'm a goat farmer, incidentally. I deny any cow associations, though my son is somewhat inclined in that direction. And, you know, I hope to get off the farm before he gets out of hand. But the fact of the matter is, it's the breakdown of ecological systems within agriculture that's the problem. And it's the reason that is happening is that profit is the driver. There is only one product in the capitalist world, and that is profit. And it doesn't matter if you're producing cars or cows. The one product is actually profit. That's what the purpose is. Now, small farmers like me, who are idiots, don't make much in the way of profits. In fact, if there's any tax people present, I never made a profit, I promise. And actually, I'm telling almost the truth. I rarely make a profit, but on the other hand, I eat well. And I'm not suggesting that everybody can have a goat farm, but if you want to learn about goats, see me afterwards, because I do goat courses. But it is quite possible, and small farming is some of the answer, and cooperativization of small farmers is one of the answers. And I'll be as quick as I can, but I have a friend who is an agricultural advisor, or was, for the United Nations. He assures me 3 African countries he's seen a development of better use of existing crops, indigenous crops, better coordination of farmers' work, better marketing of local markets, trade beginning to grow, starvation disappearing, the land improving, and then the IMF. And that's been the story in 3 countries he worked in. And he hates the IMF even more than I do. And I'm Irish, or I live in Ireland.
My name's Adam Rose. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party in Manchester and a beekeeper. One of the ironies of keeping bees is it's easier in the city than it is in the countryside. Yeah. I have a lot of friends in the countryside who keep bees, and basically they're battling in a way that I don't have to battle against, essentially against an impoverished and toxic environment. In fact, the countryside beekeepers, the only place their bees can feed in a safe manner is actually in the small villages that they live in, rather than in the countryside. Why is this? Well, first of all, we've cut down all our hedgerows, we have massive fields, we have all that kind of thing. But then we're poisoning the environment by putting loads of pesticides, fungicides, all this kind of thing. Martin slightly stole my thunder when he put up the pictures of the almond groves in California. I've actually driven through the almond groves. It takes quite a long time. You know, you're driving for hours, and all you see is almonds. And of course, underneath the almond trees, they don't want anything growing, so they spray it. So there's a completely dead environment under the almond trees. And then they, of course, Martin was talking about the metabolic rift. In other words, what should be a natural environment where there's natural pollinators in the environment around the almond trees, it has to be reproduced by these migratory beekeepers. If you want to create a disease factory, what you do, our bees should be about 1 kilometre apart. If you want to create a disease factory, you move bees around the country in these huge lorries, and you put them really, really close together, and that's exactly what the needs of the agricultural industry and the metabolic rifts it creates have forced the beekeepers, the commercial beekeepers, into doing. The farmer also got up and said, agriculture doesn't produce nutrition. What it does, it produces profits. That is the only thing that capitalism is interested in. It produces profits. I mean, farmers. Some farmers are well off. Some are not actually. Some are struggling. But actually, the profits it creates are really for the input industries and the output industries. So the input industries, the agriculture, the agrochemical industries, fertilizer industries, and all that sort of thing. And then the great, massive commodity companies like Cargill and all the others. Martin put up a picture. It's a bit of a question, a bit of a point. But so Martin put up a picture of double crops. And I agree that small farms aren't the way forward, but actually that kind of thing I think is the way forward. When I said capitalism produces commodities and profits rather than nutrition, that produces more nutrition but less profits, because it's just a bit more. You either need a more complicated machine or you need a few more people on the land. It's nothing to do particularly with the size of the farm, but it is a much better way of producing things, and you need fewer pesticides because you have a more natural environment and that kind of thing. But what stops it is basically the system is dominated by profits, and that's why we need to change things. But we need to change the environment. We need to completely change the overall environment. That doesn't mean we don't fight for reform. So as a beekeeper and a socialist, I fight to get rid of neonicotinoids and all that kind of thing.
No, actually, I want to come back to something that Martin talked about when he was talking about cowspiracy and the arguments about becoming vegan. Because actually, I think some of those arguments let the fossil fuel industry off the hook, and which are the biggest cause of emissions. And also, it goes to this idea that somehow if you just give up meat, you're going to have that impact. But actually, the problem is that the whole of our food production, not just the meat industry, is locked into fossil fuel use. Just think of salad, nice healthy alternative. When I was last reading about it, Martin could probably update it, lots of our salad crops, lettuce, cucumber, whatever, come from southern Spain, vast kilometres of polytunnels, all plastic, where stuff is grown, for supplying us, out of season. And actually it links to a lot of the issues around migrant workers and refugees, because a lot of the people after working there are people in that position in actually terrible conditions. I think that's the side to look at it, in sanitary conditions, working in the packaging there, and it's locked into the use of plastic, and also in that way. Or you think of salmon. Sometimes people think, oh, salmon's a healthy alternative. How is salmon farmed? In massive cages off the coast of Chile. That actually the demand from Walmart to supply cheap salmon has actually reshaped the whole economy of Chile in these vast cages where these fish are pumped full of antibiotics, and their poo or whatever, it covers the ocean floor and destroys the life there. So this is on every aspect. And it's interesting because whereas it's linked into the whole plastic industry, the agro-petrochemical industry. Where did this come from? You see, Martin showed a picture of protests against Monsanto. Where did Monsanto come from? Actually, in the Second World War, the US government pumped $3 trillion, I think it was, into the petrochemical industry to service the war effort, nitrogen for explosives, synthetics for parachutes and all that. It sold them after the war at knockdown bargain basement prices to what became big corporations. Locked into then these dynamics of capitalism, profit, war, the state using its might to invest in things that then become very big and dominant that people are up against. So you can't extract them from that bigger picture of capitalism. And I want to just finish on the idea of the battles, because I actually think there's loads of battles over food actually. I think they take place at every level. They take place when people are fighting for better school dinners for their kids actually. They take place at fast food rights workers actually fighting for their better rights in that industry. They take place because actually you can't miss out of these industrialised agriculture. It's the terrible conditions of meat workers, for example, in the US where the production lines are so quick. Is that to stop?
Oh no, you've got 1 minute.
All right. The industrial production lines are so quick, the rate of accidents is colossal for workers and actually very bad for our health because it actually means basically the animal's shit gets in your meat and then they irradiate it and that's meant to be the solution, so it's actually bad for your health but very bad for the workers. But you see a response, and to me, those sort of battles, particularly because the big concentration of a lot of food production brings workers together, offers a potential power to take on those very big mighty corporations rather than the individualised solutions often offered to us in the way of becoming vegan or whatever else.
Yeah, kind of echoing a bit what Amy just said really, but I'm from Manchester SWP. I'm vegan, but when I first initially went vegan, before I went, was political in any way. And basically, my friend was telling me about the horrors of the animal industry, and I was like, oh my god, and I went vegan. And I enjoy the diet, so I've kept on it. But actually, I've gone from, I started to address different issues, actually, started to see the links. I was unhappy with the austerity in England. I started to go to demonstrations and actually started to see the links and how it all links up to capitalism. And I went from kind of, going on at people how they should go vegan and taking Instagram photos of my food, to actually, getting involved in demonstrations and united fronts, such as the People's Assembly, Stand to Racism. Actually, I've achieved a lot more through doing that. However, each their own. It's a diet. But yeah, it's one thing I've really noticed is the YouTube trend on YouTube is the vegan bloggers, and they really just hell-bent on putting that message out there that being vegan is going to save the planet and it's the only way forward. And don't get me wrong, it's a great diet, I really like it. But by bullying people into becoming vegan, or by saying that you're wrong if you eat meat, or that you're wrong if you're vegetarian, you're not completely vegan, and it actually creates further divisions and actually hold back movements. And I think unity is really key. I think it's working together with people and not going, well, why do you eat like that, why do you eat that? Actually, we're all struggling together, and if you care for animal rights, you also need to stand up to racism, you also need to stand up to austerity, and basically unite with everyone else.
Hi, I'm coming from Andalusia, a region in the south of the Spanish state. We have a 35% of unemployment, 50% between young people, and 80% of the land is in the hands of a few families. So you can imagine how important for us is the property of the land. I'm a member of the Sindicato Andaluz de Trabajadores, which is a trade union that started in the 70s in the jornaleros who work in the big mono crops in Andalusia, and it's a union that works from below, from assemblies, very combative and with solidarity. So we took that model of the union from the countryside to the urban areas, and now, for example, I'm in the University of Seville, I work there, and we are building in the same way. When we occupy the lands, for example, our comrades in the rural area, and also they have our support from the cities, and we occupy the lands of public lands that are going to be sold, or we occupy the lands of big landowners. We find a very big repression from the state, from the police. Actually, right now we have a comrade in the union who is in jail, Andrés Bódalo, and he's a political prisoner in the Spanish state. He's in jail just for fighting for the rights of the jornaleros in Andalusia. Our union is the most repressed union in Europe. We have dozens of comrades who had to go to jail, and we have fees of hundreds of thousands of euros to pay because we mobilize peacefully but very strongly. Yeah, so with this example, I want to focus on the importance of the property of land, especially in the periphery of the periphery, as Andalusia is the periphery of the Spanish state is the periphery of Europe. They design our land to be land to export raw materials and cheap labor force to the core of Euro capitalism. And when you go there, for example, for tourism, now there are many tourists there because many people are afraid about going to Turkey or going to the north of Africa, to Tunisia. You will find very, very bad working conditions in hotels, in restaurants, and also in the countryside. So we need a revolution, and we need an agricultural revolution very badly.
I've got a question really for Martin about where do you see kind of the role of science and sort of GM food as sort of part of the solution really to the problems that we face? Because in my mind it's got a massive amount of potential really in terms of sort of drought resistant crops and you know, limiting the use of pesticides, like having crops that are kind of sort of resistant to parasites and things. So you know, it could go quite a long way to, you know, sort of helping with the kind of problems that we face really. I think one of the main problems with it is that the corporations have got a bit of a stranglehold on it at the moment. A lot of I think it's absolutely right that we have to support you know, movements against the big corporations and the kind of, you know, marching against Monsanto sort of stuff. But I think a lot of that is kind of, certainly a lot of stuff I see, is kind of rooted in a very kind of anti-science sort of theory, really, a lot like the kind of conspiracy people that you're talking about, because it's all kind of Franken-foods and sort of scaremongering, whereas actually the kind of scientific consensus is that there's, you know, that GM food is perfectly safe for people. There's no evidence to kind of show that, no real evidence to the contrary in all the time that it's been available. So yeah, it's kind of where do we see that really? I think you know, in one hand it's kind of we need to sort of we need to break the corporation stranglehold, but equally I think we need to do that on a sound scientific basis, based on the evidence rather than on kind of scaremongering.
The problems that Martin has described in agriculture apply to fishing, and that's what I want to talk about. Because it's the same problem. Fishing under capitalism is not about feeding people. It's about what value does the marine product you are getting have in the market. So all fish and all marine products are valued for their market price. And this system has destroyed 49% of marine vertebrate populations in the last 40 years. So that's cod, tuna, salmon, haddock, all these things. And at the same time, the development of the fishing industries around the world have been about centralising quotas. So quotas are technically supposed to preserve stocks, but they don't for various reasons. And the idea has been that if they are concentrated in fewer hands, then those capitalists will have more to invest, it will be more efficient, there'll be less waste, etc. None of this stuff actually is true, and what we have seen is that various fisheries have been managed to destruction. So Newfoundland cod collapsed, the cod stocks collapsed in 1992, which meant instantly 30,000 workers were laid off. And it didn't seem to make big news outside of Canada, bizarrely. And those fisheries have been managed for 100 years. It wasn't that people weren't paying attention, but these are finite resources. And like Martin said about the Gulf of Mexico, I mean, you cannot separate the fisheries from the rest of the climate, the rest of of what people are doing. And also Amy's example of the of fish farming, salmon. I mean, salmon has become extremely cheap because it's much more available because of fish farming, but it takes 10 kilos of ugly fish to produce 1 kilo of beautiful looking salmon. I mean, think of that. So every kilo of salmon that is produced in a fish farm destroys 9 kilos of food, just because it's not valued in on the world market because it's ugly, because it's unpopular, whatever. So, to echo what other people have said, we have to campaign for sustainable fishing and the end of the waste of bycatch and all that. But the fact is, we're never going to solve the problems of overfishing and pollution as long as we have capitalism.
Yeah, somebody asked about GM crops and should we be suspicious of science and technology, and is this... I don't think we should be suspicious of science and technology. Science and technology are important things, and farming is always involved an element of people trying to make crops more productive, to find better ways of breeding animals and all the rest of it. The problem is, with those things held in the hands of a capitalist system of agriculture, they're very dangerous, and they're not just dangerous in terms of the crops that are produced, they're dangerous actually in terms of what is the aim of agriculture. Agriculture we're talking about in terms of climate change. Agriculture, the aim of agriculture is to feed the world and is to feed human beings, and it's one of the ways that humans have always created food. And on that judgment alone, agriculture is failing very badly. We live in a world today where 795 million people still go hungry. So with all the mass production and the cropping and all the other things they're doing, it's not actually that we're not producing enough food, but that food isn't getting to the people who need it. And actually, if you want to talk about GM crops, Martin showed the picture of farmers in India protesting. When the World Bank opened up the market in India to Monsanto, Cargill, other multinationals, they introduced their GM crops, their GM seeds, that basically were season-only seeds, the Terminator gene, that meant that farmers couldn't save seeds for their future seasons, which meant that farmers had to buy them off Cargill. They then introduced a new gene that meant not only did people have to buy them off Cargill, they only then worked if they bought a certain fertiliser off Monsanto, this was, wasn't it, not Cargill, off Monsanto, I think, that works with it. And actually it led to hundreds of thousands of Indian peasant farmers committing suicides. There was a massive explosion in farmer suicides across India because people could no longer farm, they could no longer feed themselves or their families, and they were going bankrupt, and it's an absolute disgrace. And actually science and technology hasn't just been used against farmers recently. You think back to actually the famines that happened in India in the 19th century. These again were not famines because there wasn't enough food. This is famines because the food that was produced was transported by the great technology brought by the empire. The railways were used then to transport the food away from where it was needed to be sold as a commodity on the market and to be exported to other parts of the empire where the British wanted it. Unless we solve the problem of capitalism, we can't have sustainable farming, not just for the environment, but actually for the needs of human beings.
Yes.
Thank you everyone who contributed. Food for thought. Right, I want to start actually with veganism and vegetarianism because I think it's important that we don't simply dismiss people who say I've become a vegetarian because I want to stop climate change. And there are a lot of them out there. The demonstration before the COP in London, it was an appalling day in weather terms. 60 or so, 70,000 people turned out. There was a very large block of people who'd come from the vegan and vegetarian societies of Great Britain, and I welcome their involvement in the demonstration against climate change. And I think that's important because people in the face of climate change can feel completely disempowered. It's such a huge problem. What can you do as an individual? And actually, if you're sold the story that the only thing you need to do, or the most important thing to do, is to change what you eat and how it's produced, then that's a really exciting thing to do. And I think sometimes that's why vegans and vegetarians can be quite evangelical, because actually if you're convinced that all you need to do is to change your behaviour, then why not get you to change, or you to change, or you to change? Now, I don't think it's a strategy, but these are people who are trying to make the world better, and they are on our side. And I think our job is to come to them and say, look, actually this is the real problem. This is what the agricultural system is. This is the corporations. These are the power of the oil companies. Let's fight them together, which is why it was so good that they were on that massive demonstration. I think helped put pressure on the leaders at Paris in terms of the COP. And I agree with the questions and the comrades who talked about the question of GM food and so on, because I think another part of the problem is that our rulers and the big agricultural corporations, they say to us the solution's technology. They do that because it makes profit for them. And then people, of course, are suspicious. Why wouldn't you be suspicious of someone like Monsanto? Why wouldn't you be suspicious of DuPont and so on? Rachel Carson, who wrote the classic book Silent Spring about the impact of heavy pesticide use on nature and particularly on birds, makes the point that all of these corporations have their origins in the chemical warfare industry and the chemicals that were manufactured for mustard gas in the trenches and so on. They had to find somewhere to make their money, so they started switching to intensive pesticide use and so on. Why wouldn't you be suspicious of these corporations? And I think it's absolutely right, those comrades who point out that the question really isn't about the technology, it's about who controls it and why they're using it. They ain't using it to make people's lives, they don't do anything like that to make people's lives better. They do it to maximise their profits. And I certainly don't think we should dismiss technology or science. After all, farmers like our friend, the goat farmer, I've never been able to say I've had a goat farmer at my meeting before, that's brilliant. Farmers like him and generations of farmers have changed the animals and the crops that they've had. That's how we get domesticated crops and animals. It's because people have altered and changed those animals and those crops over the years. The problem is now it's happening to maximise profits. And people are given the examples of Terminator genes and so on. But there is a lot of scientific suggestion that genetic engineering, for instance, could change the way cows, the amount of methane produced by cows, by altering the way they I can't say that, well, you know what I mean, hey. Change the way that they digest their food and so on, and the amount of emissions that come out. So I'd love to see a world that can utilise that profitably. What worries me is that I imagine in the world that we live in today, they do it in such a way is that it would really hurt the animals and potentially poison the food they produce and the rest of it. I want to mention briefly the question of workers, because often the workers of the industry are completely forgotten in this industry. And let's not forget who it is, someone who produces the fruit and vegetables in the UK. It's often low-paid immigrants who are here, not necessarily below the radar, don't have the documentation, who aren't even paid the minimum wage, who have worked very, very hard. The stories of slave labour and so on. And often that forms a part of the industry. But even in places where it's very well organised. There's a very important study from a couple of years ago of the Dutch pig farming industry that shows that 40% of Dutch pigs are infected by a particular virulent strain of pig MRSI. And that is present in 35% of the meat that makes it onto the market in Holland. 50% of Dutch pig farmers have got pig MRSI. Now, what that means for the people who are working in the industry, the long hours, the hard work, the low pay, and the impact upon your health is something I think we need to understand. And when actually the tragedy, there's lots to talk about the fishing industry, but I think it's a real tragedy that that small fishermen get pulled into backing Farage in the Lexit thing, because they see the EU as what's destroyed them, and he uses their role as a sort of like standing up for the little man, actually, but in the interest ultimately of big business. And I think the left should be the people who are reaching out to those sort of industries and those forgotten economic industries and saying we're part of that fight. Two final real points before I finish. Not only the fact that the system itself is geared towards maximisation of profits, all the other aspects to it, the whole system of subsidies from governments and the EU and so on, is geared towards giving money to the big corporations and the big landowners. And there's great stuff written by George Monbiot in The Guardian in the last couple of years about the way, I'm just quoting from here, the farm subsidies, because they're given on the basis of the amount of land you own, you get more if you've got more land. And oddly enough, the oil sheikhs who own huge tracts of Yorkshire get more and more money, even though they don't pay taxes. They get agricultural subsidies. And George Monbiot describes it as the system of agricultural subsidies in the UK has been a way of giving money to the 0.1%. That's what, and we need to break that and argue against that and for a different way of doing it. The final, suppose, I think, is to come back to the question of what we need to do now. You see, agriculture can be more environmentally friendly. There's no doubt about it that there are places in the world where food is produced in a much, much more sustainable way, in a more healthy way, in a more flavoursome way as well, because of the way the peasants and the farmers themselves have managed to take control of some aspects of their lives. And you see it on a small scale with people who take great pleasure in their allotments and so on, but because they can have the time and money to be able to put into that allotment. I mean, Adam has told me in the past how much his honey, because of the amount of work he puts in it, would actually cost £30 a jar or whatever. He's never given me a taste. Is that it shows that it's possible to do this in a much better way. And one of the amazing things, and again it's forgotten, is that there are mass movements out there fighting for this stuff. The Brazilian landless workers movement, who go out and occupy large sections of the land and distribute it and break it up and take it from absentee landlords. These are real struggles in the here and now, which we don't hear about often. But they are also often very much people who are taking the environment seriously in questions of climate change. I suppose that's the finishing point, really. Because one of the things about climate change is that agriculture makes climate change worse, particularly because of how it's organised. But climate change will make agriculture worse as well. There will be less food in the future, there will be worse food in the future, there will be more hungry people in the future as a result of climate change. And if we want to feed the world, and if we want a sustainable agriculture, we have to smash the system that is destroying the planet in that interest. And that means building mass movements, using the largest number of people in their most powerful positions, the point where they make the food, they grow the food, they distribute the food, and all the other things that workers are doing, using their power to challenge the corporations and challenge big business. And that's the task, really. That's the historical task we face as the left, as the trade union movement, as the socialists, and indeed those people who work the land and in all the different ways around the world. That's what we'll have to do. If we don't do it, the destruction from climate change will wreak havoc on millions of people's lives and create hunger on an enormous scale. We cannot face that future. We have to build the alternative now, and that means getting organised and fighting back.